Doug, great to meet you, man.
Nice to meet you.
You were talking about this trench knife. I love this thing because it's a conversation starter.
Oh, yeah.
So what were you saying?
I was saying that some of the guys that carried this in World War II would machine down or grind down one side of the guard here so that they could carry it flatter against their body so it wouldn't stick out in the sheath when they were doing things like jumping and stuff. So when you find those with it ground down, it's pretty awesome.
That's super cool.
They're hard to find, though.
See, they are really hard to find.
They are.
And
they're pricey.
They're pricey. Yeah.
I love this and the 1917 version, which is got a triangular shaped blade.
I haven't seen that.
Oh, yeah. So the blade itself isn't a flat blade like this. It's triangular, and it doesn't have individual hole slots for your fingers. It's got a single guard with knuckles built on the outside of it.
Huh. Look at that. See, you got to bring a CIA guy in to tell you the history of trench knives because that's because that's what we do here. You got to bring smart guys in to tell us how to do shit. You know what I mean? Or
I'm just
history.
a geek. There you go.
You know, and I noticed you're wearing an Aries watch.
I am.
Do you know Matt?
So I know Matt via social media, but we've not met face to face.
Okay.
But I got this watch from him about 2 years ago.
When he first fired that thing up. Yeah, he's a great guy.
He seems like it. We've had a lot of fun connecting on it, and I've been talking to his son about they're doing some neat promo stuff coming up soon, and so yeah. So,
let's get into this, man. You're a former CIA guy. When did you leave? When did you leave the office?
So I left in '99. So I'm a Cold War in between wars guy, I guess. It's funny. So somebody was asking me like how I got into it and what started it. And I was a frat bro from the University of Texas that didn't have a clue what I wanted to do.
Right.
And like I had a 2.9 GPA, was focused on beer and girls and not necessarily in that order. And just was about to graduate, like not a clue. And CIA was interviewing on campus. And so I went down to talk to the guy and he's looking at my resume. He's looking at my transcript. He's like, oh man, I don't know. He goes, I'm looking for engineers. I'm looking for analysts. I'm looking for people that are academically probably performing better than you. He goes, the only thing I think you might be interested in or might be a fit for is the ops side. And I'm like, what's that? He goes, well, those are the guys that go out and they recruit spies and that sort of stuff. I'm like, that kind of sounds like the only part of it that I'd be interested in. And we just went from there. It was kind of wild.
So what year was that?
I was 88.
Wow.
88.
So 11 years?
Yeah. Well, so that was when I interviewed, got into 89 with the process, but 10 years.
And which is really interesting because like I only knew a few Cold War guys and we talk about the Cold War, or we talk about what they were doing and where they were going. And it's so interesting to hear their stories about what was happening in the agency. Because I was over there for 11 years as GRS guy and a couple other things. And the dinners that we would have in the evenings were some of my favorite times to work there because a lot of these guys come back as contractors.
Right.
And so you get to talk to guys. And I was talking to guys all the time that were former MACV dudes that were working in Cambodia and Laos and all these places.
And absolutely.
Yeah, it was fucking crazy, man. I walked into a bar and I was talking to this guy. He was old as shit. He had like 4 hair plugs left. And he looked like he was 100 years old. I was like, when did you come in? He's like, Bay Pigs was my first real thing. And I was like, shut up. This isn't real.
Exactly.
Yeah. But it was like, it was fucking real, man.
I had no clue yet about the history that I was surrounded by.
Right.
Like we still had instructors that had OSS experience. Like there were OSS dudes walking the hallways still and didn't have a clue. And I remember an instructor in our paramilitary course who he talked like this. And we were like, why? He didn't move his jaw. I'm like, why isn't he moving his jaw? And so one of the other instructors said, because he was 14 years old and he was fighting with the Dutch in Indonesia and he got shot in the face and his jaw is kind of just stuck and it was like, holy crap. And just to be surrounded by guys like that did amazing hard stuff in hard places was awesome.
Well, and it's like the history of the agency is so, one, it's
complicated.
It's very complicated. It's very complicated. Have you read The Brothers?
No, I haven't read it yet. I need to. It's on my list.
Yeah, it's really good. it talks about Alan and Frank Dulles, obviously, and they had such a profound impact on American foreign policy, both over and covert.
Right.
So have you gone, obviously going into the agency, did you start crawling down the rabbit hole and just the history and...
Not really until I left, right?
Really?
So, I kind of feel like I'm like those old Marines that walk around with their red baseball hats on. Like I didn't appreciate what it was when I was there. It was only after I really left that I really start to get into it. And because we were in training, right? We're down at the farm and we come back in from an FTX and we're sitting there in our BDUs, waiting on showers and stuff like that, watching this crappy old black and white TV and watching the wall fall. Right. And we'd all signed up to like go fight the Russian bad guys. Right. Yeah. And the wall's falling and we went, wait, what does this mean for us? Right. Not realizing that we were at the kind of the advent of a new dawn for the agency of what this was going to be. And all of a sudden we started getting drawn into the CT stuff and all of that, but just really didn't focus on the history of it until after I got out, but was surrounded by guys that had touched it all.
Yeah. I can't imagine and that's like going through the museum, for instance, in Langley. It's such a cool experience because you get to see it's a small museum. And, but that's one of the things I've always just truly appreciated and surrounded by people that have done some things that you're just fucking, it was crazy.
Right.
It was just like, what were you doing? And the stories moving into, how people found out about the agency if they didn't know about it because of their military past. But then what landed them there. And for me, it was really hard to conceptualize even context to what they were doing and when they were doing it. So, and I can imagine like during the obviously the 90s, there must have been like a ton of things that you guys were doing where you were like, what are we doing this? Or what are we doing this for? Did everything change at that point when the wall came down for you guys, or what happened?
Yeah, I think there was a period of time where they were trying to figure it out, right? The 90s were rough from a budget cuts perspective. Right. We lost a lot of officers that got fired or quit to go do other things. And so the agency was really kind of finding its feet. But CTC was being stood up, right? And so all of a sudden, my wife ended up working for the agency as well.
Really?
And so she ended up working in the first bin Laden unit in like the mid 90s. And back then they literally had one branch focused on Islamic extremists. Like that's how small CTC was at that point in time. And it was still mostly focused on all of the European terrorist organizations like 17 November and Red Army Faction and that sort of Baader-Meinhof stuff. And so watching that transition was a pretty fascinating transition. And I was fortunate enough, I got to do kind of 3 very distinctly different tours. I got to do a CT tour in Asia. I got to do a denied area tour. And then I got to do kind of a classic big city, nation state capital tour that was kind of benign in operating environment. So to get to see kind of that breadth of operations was kind of a pretty fun thing to be able to do.
And can you talk about those things? Like how much can you talk about them in the context of like what you're doing?
Yeah. I can talk about that stuff. I can't talk about where.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it was basically being a straight up case officer, right? A journeyman case officer going out.
But explain what that is. Because a lot of guys don't understand what even a case officer is, because when you say spy, people at the agency are like, oh, you're a case officer, right? But for the general layman, they think everybody that works at the CIA is a spy.
Right.
And I'm like, no, they got forklift drivers and, people that just shred documents and like all kinds of janitors and everything. So it's not the case. So what is a case officer?
Yeah. So a case officer's job is to go out and collect foreign intelligence and submit that basically back to Washington to respond to requirements. And they do that collection by recruiting and running assets, penetrations of various organizations who are providing that information back to us. Sometimes they know it's us. Sometimes they don't know it's us.
Right.
And we run those assets and run them on a clandestine basis and meet with them and gather that and collect that information and submit it back to DC for, policymakers' use.
And then what does it take? What does it take to go be a CO?
You mean from a skill set perspective or training and all
both,
that?
Right? It's because like a lot of people, they've asked me this and I'm like, I don't know because I was never a CO. So I can tell you kind of from my perspective as to what it takes, but what does it take from your perspective? Like, because I get this question a lot in DMs, like, how do I become a Green Beret? How do I become a Navy SEAL? Like, how do I join the agency? Right? I'm like, I don't fucking know. Call a recruiter. Like, right. So it's like, hey, you want to be a spy? And this isn't a recruiting forum for, the agency by any stretch of the imagination, but you got an actual CO here. So you might as well tell people what it takes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm a fan of the agency, right? As complicated as its history has been, I think we need them and we need the folks that are willing to step up and do that stuff. And so, as you talked about, there's a whole range of jobs. Like if somebody wants to serve in the agency, there's literally no job they can't do there. Yeah. And so, but from a CO's perspective, like we need people that are willing to go out and meet with people. So the skill sets required are like, are you able to manage relationships? Can you go out and meet new people, operate kind of without a lot of direction, responding to requirements, developing relationships, and then ultimately managing the aspects of that relationship in a way that keeps the asset safe, secure, and alive. Because one of the key components of it is pretty much everything you're doing as a CO, you're breaking the law of the nation you're operating in. Right. And, the worst case that's going to happen to me is I might get arrested and maybe roughed up and then kicked out of the country. Right. But for the folks who I'm meeting with, we've seen countless cases of them being imprisoned for life or executed for the work that they've done to help support us. So that CO has to have a strong focus on understanding, how do I take care of this person? How do I protect them? How do I be secure in our operations? So you got to be smart, right? You got to have super high degree of integrity. And you got to be willing to go out there and focus on something other than just your own goals.
Right. And how hard is the farm?
It's interesting. I didn't think it was hard. I thought it was fun. But we had a lot of people wash out. And so, clearly it was hard, because there's a screening process throughout, right? You're being stack ranked against, the rest of your class, but it was some of the most fun stuff I've ever gotten to do in my life. But, it was stressful. They pile a lot of work on you and they're trying to see how well you handle this stuff and handle the pressure. While being able to respond to the tasks that they're placing in front of you. So different folks handled that differently. And folks made it through that probably shouldn't have. And then we saw that later on in tours where they kind of washed out of tours. And then there were probably folks that didn't make it through that probably should have. But, for whatever reason, they failed in exercise and washed out.
And then, so you as you go through the farm and you graduate and you're given your assignment, right? Yeah. And so did you go to Southeast Asia first? Is that where you went?
I did. Well, actually, the very first thing that they did was they were training up folks to have a CT background. So I went to work in a predecessor program to GRS. Oh, really? And went through kind of 5 months of that training pipeline. Got it. So we went out to like Bill Scott Raceway and went to Gunsight and all that sort of fun stuff with a team of us that were going through and spent time around folks like Billy Waugh and guys like that. Right. In that early day of that program, which was all inside at that point in time. It wasn't a contract. And then ultimately sent me out to Southeast Asia to a high threat post at the time where there was a lot of CT activity going on. And so, that was my first post.
That's super interesting because I met Billy a few years ago, which is a very interesting character. And I also, I was at a site several years later where Bob Baer had been. And I remember because I'd read a few of his books before I had actually joined, and he had a few pictures of the places. I was like, oh, that was the picture of him doing whatever he was doing in this place, right? Right. But so did you ever run into a guy like that, Bob Baer, for instance? Was he cruising around when you were? So during my time frame I avoided headquarters like the plague. Yes. Right? Yeah, for sure. So if I was back in CONUS, I was in training somewhere. Right. Yeah. Right. And so I was almost never at headquarters. And so my only interactions when I was at headquarters were with either EA or CTC folks. And so I knew of Bob, but had never met him while I was in. So in a small world circumstance, because I went to work for a guy named John McGaffin. Sure. You know John, right? So John was one of the first guys I went to work with back in the day. like 2004.
Okay.
So he was already out. So he was the former DDO.
Yep.
And I met John through another guy, and he's like, hey, why don't you come to work for me? I'm doing some stuff in Iraq. I'd love to have you part of it. And then he had hired Bob back in the day. So all those guys knew each other. And this guy, John McGaffin, is like, from my perspective, he's like the old school, quintessential spy. Like the penny loafers and dockers and like drinks, or did. I don't know if he still does, but drinks like a fucking fish.
Yeah.
Cusses like a sailor, has probably, a master's degree. I know he went to Berkeley or one of those like
super smart.
Yeah, super smart.
Yep.
Like he's a Hemingway-esque character, right? That's how I would describe this guy. And he was the first kind of quintessential old school CO I'd ever been around. And I was like, man, how many of these guys? Because these guys are like, there can't be too many of these guys around. But when you see them, you're like, oh, okay. Yeah. I know this guy. I know this character, for instance. So did you see that, I guess, when you're kind of like moving through the entire agency and evolution, like this older generation? Because these guys were fucking hard.
They were. Yeah. I mean, I remember, I won't say his name, although I think it's public, but I remember walking through headquarters one day and seeing this guy, and his face was burned and his arm was burned. And so I'm like trying to figure out what's going on. And he clearly had a bunch of surgery to repair it. They're like, oh yeah, he was shot down in Africa, supporting rebels in the Congo. And, the plane caught on fire, and but he was this similar, like a Berkeley or Harvard or something kind of guy who just got shot down and ended up spending 14 days crossing the African bush trying to stay alive and get out. And so you'd meet these guys, and there's like story after story after story like that. And gals like Marty Peterson, was the first female CEO sent to Moscow and totally got wrapped up there through no fault of her own.
Right.
And just folks that did some pretty amazing stuff. And watching it change a little bit from the old school Cold Warriors to a heavy focus on the kind of paramilitary, HVT kind of work. And then I think you'll see the pendulum swing back a little bit again towards, more old school stuff.
Well, it kind of has to, right? Which is one of the things I want to talk to you about, which is, I have my perspective, which is my opinion only, right? And it's a limited opinion based on my experience, but we have really big strategic threats, I think.
100%. Yeah.
And I think there has to be a fairly definitive shift as far as the intel work that we're doing now to recognize the strategic threats and then really pursue them with, I would say, the hard work, like the blocking and tackling that we really need to do in the intelligence community. And I guess like one of my questions is, how do you do intelligence work while trying to be woke in the government, right? How do you do those things? Do they match?
I don't know. It's a good question, right? I mean, I think there's aspects of it where you can. One of the things that I always appreciated when I was in the agency was how apolitical almost everybody was.
Right.
And I feel like it's still that way largely inside, even though it doesn't feel that way outside, because you've got so many voices out there that seem to have chosen a political stance and then speak to that or against, the other side. And so there's a lot of those voices that are out there talking that way. But I think at the core of it, the folks that sign up every day to go into headquarters or go into stations overseas are still focused on what are the threats? How do we counter those threats? How do we protect our people? How do we gather the information we need so our policymakers can make decisions? The biggest challenges in my mind are the fact that we tend to be shorter in time frame sight than many of our adversaries are.
Right.
I mean, the Chinese and the Russians play really long games.
Yeah.
And we tend not to do that. And we have far more rotation of people through. We don't have people making that investment to stay in for, those long timeframes to fight those targets. And I think, so there's some challenges there that we got to work our way through. But I think at the end of the day, everybody knows one administration is going to be replaced by another, maximum 8 years.
Yeah.
And so, but those threats remain fairly constant.
Well, do you think that the executive office really has the authority to make a huge, impactful changes to kind of the strategic direction of the intelligence community?
It's interesting. So I work, I'm the chairman of the board of the James W. Foley Foundation. So Jim Foley was a journalist who was beheaded by ISIS. We all saw that on YouTube.
Yep.
And so I'm the chair of that organization. And one of the things we look at is how do we work with the U.S. government on hostage affairs. And so we've gotten a chance to watch the Obama administration. We've gotten a chance to watch the Trump administration. And now we're watching the Biden administration. And it's clear to us as we watch how they leverage or set up the NSCs under each of those administrations absolutely has an impact on the intelligence community on foreign policy issues. And one of the things we noticed in both the Obama and Biden administrations is that they have bigger, more bureaucratic NSCs that get wrapped up in longer decision-making cycles, more analysis required in order to get something done, more signatures. And it slows down the process of being able to do stuff like bring hostages home.
Right.
And so I think that's probably a pretty good view for how they interact with the intelligence community more broadly as well, that it's going to depend on how focused they are on the bureaucracy versus executing the missions sometimes.
Yeah, because I could feel it for sure from where I was working. You could feel the shift between the Bush administration and the Obama administration. The work didn't necessarily get different. You could just feel there was almost like a personality change in a way, right? And I think a lot of that is just coming from leadership. One of the guys, he said something about a month ago that really shocked me. So Brennan said something on CNN that really shocked the shit out of me because, from a guy that considers myself a conservative, right? I like smaller government. I think, that's kind of my shtick. I really appreciate smaller government because I really don't need it, impeding in every aspect of my life. But he said that the extremist elements of this country are teaming up, right? And he said the 2A, the libertarians, and the white supremacy listed a group of people. And I said to myself, one, I think that's really fucked up that he would identify a libertarian or libertarianism as an
extremist group. Yeah.
Did you hear that?
I did. It feels like an agenda being pushed rather than a real assessment of a threat that needs to be mitigated.
Right. And that's the thing I wanted to ask you, which was, do you think some of this narrative out there that I've kind of, I've seen and I've heard, right? Brennan saying this one, I think is, you're the former, it's like the former DNI, right? Or something like that.
Well, he was DCI.
DCI, right. Yeah. And for you to identify, or for him to identify as like people that are pro 2A and libertarian as some form of extremist, I think that's, for a lack of a better term, I think one, it's unjustified. Two, I think it's really inaccurate because there's a ton of libertarians that are a legitimate political party in the United States. So I don't know how you can just identify that as an extremist portion of that country. And then to not be called out on that, which is it's a constitutional right to own a firearm. You can't just lump that in with these other people. It's frightening. Actually, I think it's a little bit frightening for a portion of our country to think that way.
When a tiger eats a villager in East India, it's just being true to its nature. The tiger itself isn't, doing anything wrong. In this case, I think Brennan's being true to his nature. And while I agree with you on those points, I understand why he believes them.
Why? I want to know why.
I think it's because I think it's the core of what he believes. He believes he knows better than many other people, and he can't see the other side. Like I don't think he's able to develop an empathetic understanding of why other people would be where they are. And so to him, he can't really understand why you or I would want to own a firearm.
Right.
And certainly not for the breadth of reasons we might want to own a firearm, right? He probably would say, well, yeah, as long as you own your double-barreled shotgun, you're for hunting, you're good to go.
Yeah, it's the Biden thing, right?
Right.
It's like go buy a shotgun.
Right. So, but I really think it's rooted in ego and hubris and thinking you actually know better and thinking that we, middle America, need to be educated on this stuff. And clearly we'll come to right thinking if we have it said enough for us in time. And I think it's wrong, right? And I think it carries forward or carries across the coastal elites, so to speak, where they truly think they just know better than the rest of us.
Yeah, it feels like that to me. It feels like there's a section of our government that, one, I don't know if it's necessarily a organized or orchestrated information operation, right? Because that's the one thing I'm always trying to figure out. Is this IO? Like, are we just in an IO campaign? Because one of the things that I get this question a lot, which is, how much is the socialist agenda, do you think, organized and orchestrated from, the political elites, or is it just something that they believe in and they think they're just regurgitating talking points? Like, do you think there's an organized, we'll call it the, socialist agenda that is being, pushed across all the media platforms in the United States? I hear this one a lot.
I really don't. I do think it is relatively organic. Mm-hmm. I think the extremes on both sides probably are a little bit at risk of thinking that their agenda is the right agenda without thinking about how do we manage. We've got a complex problem set. We've got a diverse population. We've got a complex history that we want to continue to make sure we maintain culture that we're hoping to continue to support in this country. And so I don't think it is an organized effort in that regard. So
you don't think like George Soros is out there, like, pushing the buttons on this?
Yes. So I think he is trying to fund things, use his money, put it to work in thought tanks, think tanks and places like that. So yeah, it is organized to that level. But at the end of the day, having been in the government for as long as we were, my belief that the government can actually execute on a conspiracy theory at that level over time, I find it hard to buy into, that it's able to be pulled off consistently over time. But I do believe that there are folks who have resources that put that resource to work to try and convince people to buy into what they think is the right platform.
Right.
So I think the answer is somewhere in the middle then.
How are we looking up there, Sergeant Best? On target, on time, boys! Fire for a flip! Here we go! Set! You heard him! Fire for a flip!
Well, I think the same thing, by the way, which is, and I've said this to a lot of different people, which is the United States government specifically, even within, we'll call it the more covert or clandestine capacity, it's like a leaky ship.
It really is.
It's not 100% airtight, guys. Like, it really isn't. You've got a lot of people that want to write a lot of books. They, seek a lot of fame and fortune. It's not as if there's a cabal of the Illuminati sitting there going, well, we're only going to let this one out.
Right. Right.
We're going to let this one out. And I think with the increase of, I would say, the more extremist portions of information, there's a lot of conspiracy theorists, which, by the way, I love conspiracy theory. I love conspiracy theory because it's fucking super fun. It's like the National Enquirer for me. So I love it.
And it's fun to explore and pull the threads on and see.
Yeah, for sure. Super fun, right? So, as we're talking kind of about, socialist agendas and conspiracy theories, I got to ask you, you're part of the CIA. What's your take on whether or not the CIA had a part in the JFK assassination?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah. I don't believe so, but I understand why people do.
Right.
And I understand why the Russians would be more than thrilled to continue to carry some of that narrative forward and make sure that stuff gets out there. But at the end of the day, I do not believe the CIA had any reason ultimately to do it. At the end of the day, the agency best is served by being a truly apolitical organization, going out to fight those threats. And everybody knows that this administration will pass. You just got to survive that administration or this administration and get through. And you still got budget, you still got resources, and you still got targets to fight. So that's why I think not.
Yeah, I mean, I have my theory on it too, but we what
is it?
Well, I think I I think that you had a lot of people or competing interests that were out there, right? I mean, I think you had this really complex history within, I think you had the Alan Dulles guys that were like hardcore loyalists to Alan Dulles. And then you had the Bay of Pigs, which there's a lot of animus directly correlated to the Bay of Pigs. If I'm the commander-in-chief, if I'm the commander-in-chief, the last thing I want to do is piss off the 1,000 guys in the United States that are professionally trained to organize and execute coups and fucking shoot people in the face.
Right.
It's the last thing I want to do. So when I look at it and I say, okay, if there was a connection, I think there was probably a loose connection between, if there was a conspiracy, right? So going down the conspiracy thread, I look at it from he pulled air support on basically the day of the invasion, the Day of Pigs. And then you had a bunch of guys that were killed and captured on the beach down there. And they'd spent years, like this goes back to the Eisenhower administration. And you had guys that were preparing and going to the bank on the fact they were going to have air support.
We told them they would. We absolutely told them they would.
Yeah. And so now what you've done as the commander-in-chief is you have just pulled the carpet out from under a group of people that have been spending their lives for the last several years preparing to overthrow a government.
Yep.
Boy, I'll tell you.
I get it. Yeah.
You know, you to think about that in the context of you just made a group of enemies that are not the people that you really want to piss off.
Motive and means.
Yes.
Right? I mean, there is means and motive. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there was anything outside of the fact that, hey, you pissed off a bunch of CIA guys. And at that point, I think you know it too, because the history of the agency, these guys were operating pretty fucking loose.
They were 100%. Especially pre-church.
Yeah.
Committee.
Pre-Frank Church.
Yeah.
These guys were hanging it out there, doing their own thing. Not a lot of accountability. You know, Alan Dulles wasn't the what we'll call it the best at understanding the micromanagement aspects of what people were doing, as far as like, there were a lot of people that just ended up fucking dead that they really didn't quite even understand as to, okay, well, we're sending guys into different areas in China and they'd have like hundreds of guys ultimately just disappear.
Right.
And,
I mean, to be fair, they thought they were doing what was right.
For sure.
Right. Like, go out, here's your message set, go execute on it. But yeah, zero oversight really, and some mistakes made for sure.
For sure. And I think that the connections between some of this, they're disturbing, right? So when you look at when you follow the lines through Alan Dulles and the Nixon administration, and then some of the guys that were involved in the Deep Throat connection to Watergate, and then Hunt, obviously. These are weird connections that are directly feedback into Alan Dulles, where you're like, how is it that the guy that also helped, Alan Dulles write some books for his own internal, biographies and things like that, was also the guy that was rolled up in Watergate.
But correlation is not causation, right?
I firmly agree. I firmly agree. Like I am 100%. I'm not like feeding those into.
No, I know.
But I do love this. Like, it's one of my favorite things to really think about.
And if I jump back to where we are today, like when I look at organizations like Davos or Council on Foreign Relations or Aspen Institute, not to pick out any one of them as a bad guy, they don't do themselves any favors in this conspiracy world either, because it is so clear that most of the attendees there literally believe they know better than anybody who's not attending there.
Right.
And so there's not transparency of what they're hoping to do. There's not transparency of why they're doing it. But it's a self-licking ice cream cone of, their same thought model. And they're not bringing in folks to challenge themselves either. And so to the outside world, it absolutely feeds those conspiracy theorists that there is this Illuminati, there is this, elite class that really wants to rule the world.
Right.
And so they don't do themselves any favors by the way they approach all of that.
No, I know
a lot of those folks, right? Like, I mean, I worked with them. I went to school with them. Like, but they just don't set themselves up for success in a broader sense, right? By opening it up to folks and letting them see the inside of the.
And there's a lot of things I think that people could. I think there's a double-edged sword, right? And I think there's a couple things I really want to talk about before we get off the conspiracy theory thing, which is, what do you think about, because obviously the Frank Church hearings and then the family jewels, obviously, those were super interesting. And then, rolling into Colby and then Bush, because you were there. Were you there when Bush was? Yeah. So
he signed my commissioning certificate.
Did he really?
Yeah.
So I've heard this one, which is, what do you think the chances of Bush Sr. being
I was there when Bush Sr. was president, not when he was DCI. Right. So Webster was my first DCI.
Yeah. Got it.
Right.
Webster.
Yeah. So, yeah.
So what do you think? Have you heard this one where Bush Sr. was a knock? Have you heard this?
I have heard that.
Theory? Right.
Yeah. That's wild to me.
It's wild.
There's just,
it's wild.
There's just no way. I mean...
It's interesting. It is interesting because when you think about it, his first, I've gone down the rabbit hole on this one, which is his first business, his wildcatting business was Zapata Oil.
Yep.
And then Operation Zapata was the original op name for the Bay of Pigs.
Right. No, I know.
And I'm like, it's fucking weird, man. And he was working in, the Gulf of Mexico. Obviously, they'd just done, was that Guatemala back in 54?
Yeah, and the Banana Wars.
Yeah, sure. They had Guatemala back in the 50s where they overthrew Guatemala. And so they were working in the Gulf a lot and they needed logistic support in the Gulf. So I'm like, okay, man, Zapata Oil, Bay of Pigs, Senior, all those things kind of coalesce around it. If it's a super fun yarn, if you guys ever want to go down the fucking yarn string where it's like, I'm not the guy, you're not going to get Alex Jones out of me on this one. I'm just saying hey man, there's a lot of really interesting correlations. And the other thing that really struck me is odd was, that he lost all the records from Zapata in a fire. 8 years of Zapata were lost in a fire. The most crucial years where he needed. He's one of the only guys to get Lloyd's of London to reimburse him for a Go Plat too. Right.
So I'll say this about that, or Bush and Zapata.
Yeah.
In my mind, Bush was not a knock, but that doesn't mean Zapata couldn't have been a friendly platform leveraged by folks.
Yeah.
Those two things are not mutually exclusive, right? And actually, I would say their likelihood of a knock and a platform being used at the same time in that way would be pretty small. Mm-hmm. And so that to me would be a more likely way of leveraging an American business like that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when you think about Bush Sr. and then Alan Dulles, they were friends, right? So they were friends. So. And then Junior, obviously, not Preston, but Bush Senior, right? For him to go out and just strike out on himself in Texas and start going into the oil business, it's not unusual. It's just I think you're right in the context of I think that there are probably enough. There's correlation and causation, obviously, but there's enough connections between personal relationships and business where the company might have been. Used as a friendly, whatever cutout. It wouldn't be a cutout, I guess, because it really wouldn't. It's not the right. What do they call that? The fucking business is not really a business. Whatever it is, right?
I can't remember.
It's a business that's functioning. Yep. It's a shell.
Shell company.
Yeah, shell company. There we go. But it's a fun yarn.
But it clearly wasn't a shell. I mean, it was a legit operating business. Yeah. Which is if you want to get into it, is way better to use than a shell company anyway, especially if you want to look at today's access to public records and all of that, right? Think about the folks that jump online and track tail numbers of airplanes seen in interesting places and then go, wait, that company was set up 3 years ago and it owns 3 Gulfstreams. And,
then all of a sudden rendition is rolled up.
Right.
And then it's exposed and then there's a movie 2 years later.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. It's freaking nuts.
Yes.
Yeah.
The lesson there is don't underestimate the Italians.
Yeah. Don't underestimate.
There's no such thing as a friendly service.
No.
Friendly liaison service. I mean, we have relationships, but there's really they always have their own interest at heart.
Oh, absolutely.
And they should.
Yeah, for sure. And I think as things start to advance, in the international intelligence community, I think, you've recognized a couple really fucking cool points, which I think we can highlight, which, the Chinese are playing the long game, right? And that to me, from my small little podium here, that to me is our most prominent strategic threat. Like I look at it and I'm like, that I think the Chinese are our most prominent strategic threat. Do you have a different perspective, or can you shed some light on?
No, I'd agree. I mean, I'm not sure I would place them above Russia.
Really?
Yeah, but I certainly would place them at the same level, right? I think they're different threats. I think the reason the Chinese threat is maybe where you think it is because it's both a geopolitical and an economic threat,
right?
As opposed to really the Russia thing is still the throwback to the great game of geopolitical,
right?
And far less economic in nature. And so I think they're both really, really important threats for us to be paying attention to. And I think it's going to be fascinating. You know, the Russians just PNG'd 10 embassy officials. They told them yesterday, I think it was.
Yeah.
And watching to see what our response will be interesting. The Chinese, they're good.
They're good.
I mean, their service is good. They really do play that long game. They're really good at leveraging familial connections. They're really good at, shall we say, encouraging the Chinese diaspora around the world to cooperate.
Right.
It's codified in their law that they have to, that they're supposed to leverage the Chinese around the world in their intelligence collection efforts in a way that our law almost prevents us from doing. And so I think there's some things like that they have an advantage on us that are going to be difficult to counter.
Well, and it's interesting because they've really expanded their, I would say their not only their impact, but their interests and their economic and both military interests. And when we look at even just the continent of Africa.
Yeah, I immediately was thinking that, right?
Yeah, and have you kept up with kind of what they're doing just on the continent itself? And,
yeah, a little bit. I mean, I've been watching what they've been doing in mining, and going in essence. Well, so the Vietnamese, after the Vietnam War and with normalization of relations, one of the things they talked about was the risk of peaceful evolution, right? Meaning that they'd won the war, but they would lose the peace to the MTVification of their own nation. And I think the Chinese have taken an approach like that. We don't have to go into hot wars if we can basically take over significant economic aspects of these places and control natural resources, control trade, control ports.
Right.
And so you could win that war, so to speak, without ever having to even have most folks know you're in a war.
Right.
And so I think that's really what we're seeing them try and do in Africa is gain control of those resources and then be able to leverage that when appropriate.
I think that's my assessment too, which is I think that they look at us as kind of blithely stumbling through our international existence, and they're going to essentially continue to expand their economic and military power, but mainly it's economic,
right?
And which, you know, if you just take a look at the continent, to your point, the mining interests, and we'll just call it general economic interests. I see this as the Chinese are really serious about playing a very long game with the United States, and really, I think they can accelerate it based on our we'll call it our missteps. I think that us being involved in the Middle East for as long as we have, into the detail, I think, to not only the expense, but also the distraction.
Yeah, look over here.
Yeah. I think that has directly impacted our ability to look at the Chinese and the Russians as a real threat. But I'd love to hear what your 2 cents is on that.
No, I completely agree. I mean, I think without getting into a long discussion about whether it's right to leave Afghanistan or whether the Iraq wars were the right thing to do, there's aspects of it that were right, and there's aspects of the execution of it that were, bumbled and that sort of stuff. I think we do have a tendency in a national security establishment perspective to focus on things rather than to maintain a broad view on what's going on. And I think so we've been drawn into this world of, sandbox for 20 years that a lot of people have made a lot of money off of the fact that we're still there. And I think that makes it difficult to allocate resources to look at other parts where threats are still real or developing there. And so I think it's definitely worked to their advantage. We're hamstrung also by our own efforts at transparency, which I think is important because we want, that's a key to who we are. But, when you're going up against an adversary that doesn't have to be as transparent with budget, with plans, et cetera, I think you're at a disadvantage there as well.
Well, I think that's my question, which is how do you maintain transparency, and how do you maintain, I think, the freedom of the democracy while fighting essentially a fascist regime? Because ultimately, I don't think that you could classify Russia as a democracy.
No,
right?
Nope.
I don't.
How many years has Putin been?
Since my entire adult life, right? So
no.
Yeah, so no. And obviously, he plays by his own rules. I think he's probably the single most powerful person in the world, from my perspective.
And didn't you just recently pass a law that said that no president could ever be charged for any crime committed during their own or after?
I think so, right? It's like he might have even written his own name in there.
What was it? Mel Brooks said, "It's good to be the king."
Yeah, exactly. Right? How do you do that? How do you? One, I think every 4 years when you're rotating the chair of the executive office, every 4 to 8 years, how do you maintain your strategic insight and execute against, I think, really strategic foes while maintaining democracy and rotating the chair every 4 to 8 years?
Yeah, I think it's hard. I mean, it's so hard, right?
Yeah.
I think it gets to the core of who we are as a people and why I think it's so important that we stay in touch with our history so that we inform every generation that's coming up of the need to continue to fight for something that's real.
Right.
I know how important culture is to you at Black Rifle Coffee. Like, it's the key to why you can do what you do. And I think nationally, we have some of that same need to maintain culture and connection to where we've come and why we've done the things that we've done in order to be able to do that when we need to do it going forward. Otherwise, you just get too swung by the whims of what's happening, and it's distraction and you're responding to it. So I think it's trying to find ways to maintain and reinforce that culture within our nation and within our military, within our educational systems, so that we got people that are willing to step up and do it.
Yeah. Do you think that the Chinese and the Russians, do you think they're at this point openly or covertly manipulating information to pit us against each other?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, are they doing it? Well, one, if they're not doing it, they're probably not doing their job, right? Because when I think about the role of an intelligence service, both on offensive and defensive operations, like, you take advantage of all the tools you can against the adversary that you deem as your primary adversary. And with the access to the tools that are now available for electronic communications and data manipulation, et cetera, they would not be doing their job if they weren't trying to do some of that.
Right.
And we 100% would be doing the same where we have the right findings to do so. And so, yes, I think so. Is it as effective? Is it all the things we've seen, brought out as foreign action? I don't know. Right. I think, and I don't know that we'll ever know, but 100%, I believe they're trying to do that. And it's part of what their job is to do that. So, yeah, and we make it easy.
We do make it easy. Like that's the other thing, which is maintaining democracy, right? It's like, how do we maintain a democracy and transparency of information without pursuing, we would say, manipulated information being kind of executed across the board, especially when information is so easily accessible. Yeah, I've thought about it a lot where, how we have a relatively small YouTube channel, but there are a lot of people that have really large YouTube channels that hit millions of people. Those are not hard people to impact or manipulate, right? But you can really reach a lot of people with a small number of just, we'll call them YouTubers.
In the human world, we used to call folks like that, or a potential asset like that, a useful idiot, where you could actually manipulate somebody to achieve a goal without them ever even knowing that you had manipulated them, and who would have been resistant to a direct recruitment effort. And so that I think you're 100% right. It's very easy to manipulate folks, especially folks who sit in an echo chamber of their own reinforcing world where they just keep hearing, folks telling them what they think they want to hear. You don't have to turn them 180 degrees to be effective. Right. You just got to shift them off plumb line a little bit.
Yeah.
And the further you get out, the further you're away from plumb line. And I think, so there's absolutely that taking place.
Well, I think with the misinformation, and I would say, because I think that's what it is, a lot of it's misinformation. There was a report, I think last week, where the CIA confirmed that the Russians were not paying a bounty. And this was essentially orchestrated from the Afghani government, right? But your point was these are mainstream media outlets that during the Trump administration were continuing to echo the same thing over and over and over again.
Right.
They essentially crucified the president over these things on, we'll call it CNN, MSNBC, you name it. And it was over and over and over, and it was factually incorrect.
Right. It was effective.
Right.
But false.
Right.
Right. And so, yeah, absolutely. You can see that take place.
Well, and the thing that I don't quite understand, and I do, which is now you have the Biden administration essentially saying that's factually incorrect. There's no accountability. So how do you
know?
Yeah. How do you know?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So, I teach on intelligence collection at a local university in the East Coast, and we're talking right now about OSINT and about the risk in OSINT. There's so much data out there. How do you get to what's real, separate the wheat from the chaff, and then apply the right analytical mindsets to it? And it's a process, and it takes time and resources to do it. And I think about even within friend groups and family members and so on and so forth, and their willingness to go based on the headline without reading the article.
Yeah.
So that I think that there's a critical component of critical thinking that's got to be applied on a daily basis. Like as silly as it seems, Twitter's reminding people to read the article before they retweet it.
Right.
Like you should do that.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And you really should go to original source information if you can. And so you go back to, how do we know what they're saying here? It's tough. But if you really want to know, you start digging and you start pulling at threads, and then you measure that against the other things that you know and say, okay, does it fit within these rubrics that make sense? Or is there something about it that remains off? And can I dig into that more? And you may not be able to get there all the way, but you probably can get a better sense of veracity about it than just reading that first article that somebody has forwarded on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. Right. But it takes work and effort, and we got folks that are pretty lazy. They just want to go by the headline and say this is good. Yeah,
there's a lot of really complacent, lazy people that ultimately just want to share a headline. I think that there has to be some type of accountability, right, from the media perspective. So if there's no accountability of the media and they can just publish anything they want, they can also be manipulated.
Right.
And if you're manipulating information, and especially the mainstream media, I think that's one of the reasons why there's so much distrust just in general in the mainstream media, because they're all lying.
Right.
It doesn't fucking matter. You guys are all lying. And then they go and they search for alternate forms of information. Well, that could be even worse.
Right.
Then you're like, well, fuck, there's, lizard people are controlling the earth and the earth is fucking flat. And then it just spins out into like pure fucking craziness, actually, after a while. I know you got to go here pretty soon. So I want to be very conscious of your time. What have you done since you left the agency? So what all have you done since then?
A whole bunch of different stuff. Yeah. So I'm actually CFO of a manufacturing company that makes aircraft engine components.
Really?
Yeah. Oh. We got factories all over the world and probably about 1,000 employees worldwide, and so that's a lot of fun to do.
So was that your undergrad? Were you a finance guy?
So when I left the agency, I went to grad school and got my MBA. And then transitioned into high-tech manufacturing and that sort of stuff.
Holy shit.
And then I spend a bunch of time actually working on film and TV projects.
Really?
Yeah. And
can you tell me which ones?
Sure. So did a show a couple of years ago called The Brave, which was about a Task Force Orange type organization. Right. It was on NBC. Sadly, it only made 13 episodes, but we worked on that. I was one of the tech advisors on that show.
Nice.
I work on SWAT, which is on CBS.
Yeah.
And what I get to do for a lot of these shows is I get to hire vets and put them on the shows as special abilities actors. So many of them, it's their first shot in Hollywood.
Right.
But I already know they're going to take orders well. They're going to wear a uniform well. They're going to handle a weapon and not look like an idiot.
Right.
And make the show better. And they get a little exposure to life in Hollywood. They get their first Hollywood paycheck and get them set on a path towards maybe becoming an actor. And so that's a lot of fun to do that. Cool. We made some zombie movies. Actually, JT came out and visited us on set because we were shooting a movie out in El Paso using the same helos as Range 15.
Oh, yeah.
And he came out and visited us while we were out there. And we got another one of those movies coming out later this year.
Nice.
So, yeah, do a bunch of fun stuff like that.
And where do you call home?
I live in New Hampshire now, but I'm from Texas. Right. So, we'll see. New Hampshire was a great place to raise a family. But it's freaking cold in the winter there, man.
It is cold. Yeah. it's super cold. Like, I don't know how you guys do it, to be honest with you. Like, I love it up there in the summertime.
Yeah.
Like, I love it up there in the summertime, but you get like 6 months.
Right.
And then after that, but it's the same thing. Texas, you get 6 months of good weather and the rest of it's hot, so freaking hot that you don't even want to be near it. Well, this is great, man. This has been an awesome conversation. I really appreciate you coming out and doing it. Hopefully I'll have you back.
That'd be great. Cool. Love what you guys do. It's been fun to watch you guys grow and see all the really cool stuff you're doing, like with BRCC Fund. And
BRCC Fund is like, that's the big one for us next, right? It's going to be super fucking cool. So
that's cool.
We'll get you back here, man.
All right, man. Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.